Throughout this series, we have established the foundational principle of hormone medicine, that testosterone is a survival hormone for both sexes, that progesterone is the great regulator and stabilizer, and that no hormone functions in isolation. Every hormone exists within an ecosystem, and nowhere is that ecosystem more dynamic, more nuanced, and more clinically consequential than in the female hormone system. So today's lecture, it introduces a concept that once you truly understand it, will reframe every female patient you see with hormonal complaints. So let us begin with this. Women, they do not suffer from hormone deficiencies alone. They suffer from hormonal imbalance. And that distinction is not semantic. It is a difference between measuring a number and understanding a relationship, between treating a lab value and restoring a biological rhythm. The most important balance in female endocrinology is the relationship between estrogen and progesterone. Not their absolute levels, not whether they are above or below a reference range, but the ratio between them, the rhythm with which they rise and fall, and the dynamic interaction between their opposing yet complementary effects on every tissue in female body. This relationship is what I want to call the dance. Like any dance, it requires two partners moving in coordinated complementary patterns, one leading, then the other. So when both partners are present, skilled and in rhythm, the result is elegant and functional. And when one partner is absent, weakened, or out of sync, the result is dysfunction. Not because either partner is necessarily absent, but because the collaboration, it has broken down. That is the clinical reality you will encounter again and again in women presenting with PMS, with irregular cycles, with anxiety and mood disruption, with heavy periods, with endometriosis, with sleep disorders, with perimenopausal transition symptoms. Not deficiency alone, imbalance. The dance has lost its rhythm. Your role as a clinician is not to suppress one partner or artificially elevate the other. It is to resolve the rhythm, to synchronize the dance. So let us begin with the biology. So as with the last lecture, this lecture is also divided into various sections. Section first is the nature of the relationship, complementary, not competing. The first thing I want to dismantle is the idea that estrogen and progesterone are opposing forces in a zero-sum competition. This framing, which appears frequently in popular media and even in some clinical literature, fundamentally misrepresents what these hormones do. Estrogen, progesterone, they are not adversaries, they are partners. They have got a complementary and interdependent roles. Like the core functional pairing. Think of it this way. Estrogen builds. It drives cellular proliferation, tissue growth, angiogenesis, structural development, and in the endometrium, it stimulates the growth of the functional layer in preparation for a potential pregnancy. In breast tissue, it stimulates ductal proliferation. In bone, it inhibits osteoclast activity and preserves mineral density. In the brain, it stimulates neuroplasticity, upregulates serotonergic and dopaminergic activity, and promotes verbal fluency and emotional responsiveness. In the skin, it maintains hydration, collagen synthesis, and elasticity. Estrogen is the vitality hormone, the source of physical and psychological aliveness in women. This was estrogen. Progesterone, it stabilizes. Estrogen builds, progesterone stabilizes. So where estrogen drives growth, progesterone directs differentiation. Where estrogen stimulates, progesterone modulates. Where estrogen creates cellular momentum, progesterone ensures that momentum is channeled and controlled rather than unchecked. So in the endometrium, progesterone transforms the proliferating tissue into a secretory receptive layer ready to sustain a pregnancy if fertilization occurs. In breast tissue, it supports differentiation of ductal cells and counterbalances estrogen driven proliferation in the nervous system. It converts to allopregnanolone and activates the GABAergic inhibitory tone that creates calm, improves sleep quality, and reduces anxiety. In the vascular system, it reduces fluid retention and inflammatory load. So the relationship is this. Estrogen creates the energy and the drive. Progesterone creates the structure and the stability. Neither can produce health alone. Estrogen without progesterone creates growth without governance, cellular momentum without direction, and progesterone without estrogen creates suppression without vitality, stability without energy that makes life worth living. Health exists only when both are present and in balance, and this is the first principle of dance. Estrogen creates life, progesterone protects life, and when they move in harmony, that is health. Now understand the accelerator and the brake. So this is a clinical metaphor that I find useful and that your patients will find immediately comprehensible. Think of estrogen as accelerator in the car. It provides the power, the energy, the forward momentum, like that. And without an accelerator, the car does not move. There is no vitality, no drive, no function. And now progesterone, think it as a brake. It regulates speed, prevents runaway momentum, and ensures the car responds safely and predictably to the road it is traveling on. So without a brake, the accelerator produces a vehicle that is dangerous, uncontrollable, and ultimately self-destructive. In clinical medicine, when a woman presents with symptoms of what we call estrogen dominance, breast tenderness, bloating, mood swings, having heavy periods, or anxiety, or endometrial thickening, this is almost always because the accelerator is working, but the brake has failed. Progesterone is insufficient related to estrogen and the estrogenic drive. Estrogenic drive is proceeding without adequate modulation. The clinical instinct is to just suppress the accelerator to reduce estrogen. This is frequently misguided. The correct intervention in most cases is to restore the brake, to bring progesterone back into its regulatory role, and when that happens, the symptoms of estrogen dominance frequently resolve without ever needing to touch the estrogen itself. This was section 1. Section 2. The menstrual cycle, the dance in motion. So to understand clinical dysfunction, we must first understand what normal function looks like. The menstrual cycle is not simply a reproductive mechanism. It's a monthly hormonal choreography of extraordinary precision and clinical significance. Like phase 1, follicular phase or estrogen rising phase. So the cycle begins with menstruation, the shedding of endometrial lining that occurs when both estrogen and progesterone fall at the end of the previous cycle, and from the day 1 of bleeding, FSH from the pituitary gland begins recruiting follicles in the ovaries, and rising level of estrogen, primarily estradiol, drive the early follicular phase. Clinically, this estrogen rising phase is often experienced by women as an improvement in energy, mood, and cognitive sharpness. Libido typically increases, physical vitality returns, the world feels more manageable, and this is the biological signature of rising estrogen acting on the brain's serotoninogenic and dopaminergic systems, thereby increasing emotional responsiveness, verbal fluency, and reward sensitivity. And meanwhile, in the endometrium, Estrogen is driving the proliferative phase. The functional layer is regenerating, thickening, and vascularizing in preparation for a potential implantation later in the cycle. The cervical mucus becomes increasingly watery and receptive. The body is preparing. So that was phase 1 of the cycle. Phase 2 will be ovulation, the peak and the pivot. Approximately at mid-cycle, day 14 in an idealized 28-day cycle, the dominant follicle reaches maturity and releases a surge of estrogen so pronounced that it triggers a positive feedback mechanism at the hypothalamic pituitary level, resulting in the LH surge that causes ovulation. The egg is released. This is the pivot point of the cycle. Up to this moment, estrogen has been in command. From the moment forward, the baton passes. Phase 3, the luteal phase, progesterone's stage now. After ovulation, the follicle that released the egg collapses and transforms into, corpus luteum, a temporary endocrine gland that begins producing progesterone in substantial quantities, and over the following 7 to 10 days, progesterone climbs to its cycle peak, typically reaching between 10 and 20 nanograms per milliliter in a well-functioning luteal phase. And this is progesterone stage. And it transforms the body in ways that are clinically distinct and diagnostically important. In the endometrium, progesterone converts the proliferating tissue into a secretory state, thick, nutrient-rich, and receptive. It is now biologically prepared to receive and sustain an implanted embryo. This transformation is irreversible within the cycle. Once progesterone has acted, the endometrium will not proliferate further regardless of estrogen levels, and this is a critical protective mechanism. In the nervous system, rising progesterone via its neurosteroid metabolite allopregnanolone, it deactivates GABAergic inhibitory tone. The woman typically experiences an increase in calmness, reduced anxiety, improved sleep quality, and a quieter emotional register. The energy of the follicular phase gives way to a more inward grounded quality. Basal body temperature rises slightly, a clinical sign used in fertility awareness that directly reflects progesterone's thermogenic effect on the hypothalamus. That half to 1 degree rise in the basal temperature of the body. And if the fertilization and implantation occur, the corpus luteum continues producing progesterone under the influence of HCG from the developing embryo. If they do not occur, the corpus luteum degenerates at approximately day 25 to 27. Progesterone falls, and the withdrawal of progesterone followed by estrogen triggers the endometrial shedding that initiates menstruation. The critical clinical insight is the sequence, not just the level. And here is the critical insight that separates superficial hormonal assessment from genuine clinical understanding. The symptoms most women bring to clinic are not caused by absolute hormone deficiency, that absolute deficiency of estrogen or deficiency of progesterone. No, they are caused by disruption of the sequence. The carefully timed rise and fall of each hormone in its corrected phase of cycle, like that. Progesterone that rises adequately in the luteal phase. It provides its full neurological, endometrial, and metabolic benefits. And progesterone that fails to rise because ovulation did not occur, because the corpus luteum is inadequate, because chronic stress has diverted pregnenolone to cortisol, or because the cycle is anovulatory. It leaves the second half of the cycle without its regulatory governor. The result is an unmodulated estrogen effect in the late luteal phase, producing the symptom cluster we call now premenstrual syndrome, anxiety, irritability, bloating, breast tenderness, fluid retention, and disturbed sleep. PMS, this premenstrual syndrome, in most cases is not a psychological condition, it's a luteal phase progesterone insufficiency syndrome. That reframe, along with change how you manage a large proportion of your female patients. Let me give you a clinical pearl here. If a woman's symptoms are cyclical, appearing in 7 to 14 days before menstruation and resolving with the onset of flow, the diagnosis is almost certainly luteal phase progesterone insufficiency. The symptom timing is the diagnosis before any laboratory test is ordered. That was section 2. Section 3, let us understand estrogen dominance, the most common hormonal pattern in women. So this is the most clinically consequential concept in this lecture, one that explains a disproportionate amount of female hormonal suffering that goes unrecognized and therefore it goes untreated. The clinical pattern is called estrogen dominance, and before we go further I need to correct a misunderstanding here that trips up a lot of clinicians when they encounter this term for the first time. Estrogen dominance does not mean high estrogen. It means estrogen effect is higher relative to progesterone. And this is a ratio problem. It's not an absolute level problem. A woman can have completely normal estrogen levels, even low normal estrogen, and still be estrogen dominant and her progesterone is even lower. Got my point? So low estrogen, but if the progesterone is still lower, she could again still be called as estrogen dominant woman. The tissue effects of estrogen are being inadequately modulated because progesterone counterbalance is insufficient here. The accelerator is running unchecked, not because it has been floored, but because the brake has failed. And equally, a woman in perimenopause can have falling estrogen and still experience estrogen dominant symptoms because her progesterone is falling faster, leaving whatever estrogen remains relatively unopposed. And that is why treating estrogen dominance with estrogen suppression is usually the wrong approach. You are tampering with a working accelerator when the problem is a broken brake. The correct intervention is, you have already concluded, progesterone restoration. So what are the causes of this estrogen dominance? Understanding why estrogen dominance is so prevalent, it requires understanding the multiple mechanisms through which progesterone to estrogen balance can be disrupted. Anovulatory cycle are the first most direct cause. Anovulatory cycle. Without ovulation, no corpus luteum, no substantial progesterone production. And follicular phase estrogen rise occurs without luteal phase progesterone response that should follow it. And this is increasingly common in modern world. Irregular cycles, stress-related anovulation, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and excessive exercise even. They are all associated with anovulatory cycle at various life stages. Like chronic psychological stress through pregnenolone steal mechanism we have already discussed, we established in previous lecture. It diverts steroid precursor away from progesterone synthesis and towards cortisol. The woman under sustained occupational or maybe relational stress is biologically diverting her hormonal sources towards survival rather than reproductive regulation. The HP axis prioritizes cortisol at the expense of progesterone, and the estrogen dominance is the consequence. Aging is a potent and often unappreciated driver. Aging per se. So progesterone production, it depends upon corpus luteum, which in turn depends upon healthy ovulation, and a woman approaches perimenopause. typically late 30s it starts actually. Ovulation becomes less regular, corpus luteum function becomes less robust, and progesterone levels begin declining. So estrogen meanwhile fluctuates more dramatically but does not decline in a linear fashion like progesterone. The result is an increasingly unfavorable progesterone to estrogen ratio that can persist for a decade or more before estrogen levels begin their perimenopausal decline. And insulin resistance, again, it creates a hormonal environment that actively promotes estrogen dominance. Elevated insulin stimulates ovarian theca cell androgen production. Elevated insulin, I will repeat, stimulates theca cell androgen production in ovaries, which is then aromatized to an estrogen in adipose tissue. And while simultaneously also it impairs ovulation and therefore progesterone production. So insulin impairs ovulation, insulin stimulates theca cell to produce more testosterone, aromatization, again estrogen. So the metabolic syndrome in women is not just a cardiovascular risk pattern, it's a hormonal disruption pattern that feeds directly into estrogen dominance. Then environmental xenoestrogens. They deserve specific mention because they are clinically underappreciated and practically unavoidable. What will you do about them? So these xenoestrogens, they are synthetic or natural compounds that mimic estrogen at receptor level, including bisphenol A from plastic containers, phthalate from personal care products, pesticide residues on non-organic produce, and phytoestrogens in soya heavy diets. And these compounds, they add to estrogenic load without contributing to the progesterone counterbalance, incrementally worsening the estrogen to progesterone ratio in women whose hormonal balance is already under pressure. Now let us understand the symptom architecture of estrogen dominance. So the clinical presentation of estrogen dominance is one of the most recognizable pattern in functional medicine. So once you know what you are looking for, it is very, very easy to point it out. So the mental and emotional symptoms reflect both direct neurological effect of estrogen excess and neurological effects of progesterone insufficiency, anxiety, often cyclical anxiety, worsening in the premenstrual week, and then so just before menstruation starts, anxiety, there will be anxiety, and then resolving with the onset of menstruation. Irritability that is disproportionate to the circumstance and clearly follows the hormonal calendar. Mood swings that track the cycle with predictably. The patient herself may have identified those mood swings. The patient will tell you that these are related with my cycle. Emotional sensitivity and reactivity that is qualitatively different from baseline character. Difficulty sleeping in the premenstrual phase, despite feeling exhausted, wired and tired, because progesterone's GABAergic sleep promoting effect is absent. The physical symptoms are driven by estrogen's proliferative and fluid retaining effects acting without progesterone's moderating influence. So breast swelling and tenderness. Characteristically, it will be bilateral and cyclical, peaking in premenstrual phase peaking. Abdominal bloating and water retention driven by estrogen's effect on sodium and fluid handling in the absence of, you remember, the progesterone's aldosterone antagonizing action. Yes. Headaches or migraines that cluster in the premenstrual or early menstrual phase driven by the rapid fluctuation in estrogen and absence of progesterone stabilization. So migraines. Weight gain that is not adipose but it is edema, edematous weight gain, fluid accumulation that resolves with the onset of menstruation. So the reproductive symptoms are the most directly linked with the absence of progesterone's endometrial governance. Heavy prolonged menstrual bleeding because the endometrium has proliferated without adequate progesterone mediated differentiation and is structurally unstable when it sheds. So irregular or shortened cycle even. worsening PMS that in severe cases meets the criteria for premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PDD. Fibroids even, uterine leiomyomas whose growth is directly stimulated by estrogen and whose regression is associated with adequate progesterone. Endometriosis, an estrogen dependent condition whose inflammatory activity is amplified by progesterone insufficiency. Let me give you another clinical pearl here. In any woman presenting with cyclical anxiety, breast tenderness, heavy periods or bloating, always assess the timings of symptoms related to the menstrual cycle before ordering a single hormone test. If the symptoms worsen in the 7 to 14 days before menstruation, 1 to 2 weeks before menstruation, and resolve with the onset of flow, the pattern is luteal phase progesterone insufficiency unless proven otherwise. That was section 3.